committee meeting started. Today is just a hearing. We're not taking up any legislation, more of a hearing on two bills that may appear for our committee, and wanted to bring some people in town to kind of give us an explanation, answer some questions, and I appreciate them coming in town. You see the two bills that are in front of you. These are the ones that we'll be kind of talking about and going over and asking some questions and hearing some explanations that may hopefully give people a little bit better understanding about digital currency and Bitcoin and some of the opportunities that may exist in Mississippi for this. And so I'm going to ask Dennis Porter come up first, and we'll talk about the Orphan Well Bitcoin mining program. So thank you for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senators, Chairman, committee members. I appreciate you for inviting me here to discuss the policy. We're very excited about the potential to have this discussion, and looking forward to answering your questions. My name is Dennis Porter. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy organization called Satoshi Action Fund. So we work on the state level to try to educate policymakers and regulators and the general public on the benefits of this technology, which we believe include the ability to have a positive impact on the grid, the economy, and the environment. So I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Will you kind of go over the Orphan Well program with this legislation is talking about, and kind of give everybody understanding of how it works? And
absolutely. So if you go to our executive summary, which I hope that you have in front of you there, it's the Orphan Well Bitcoin mining program. Some of you might have a copy, some of you might not. But the premise of this bill is that there is hundreds, maybe thousands of abandoned oil and gas wells here in the state of Mississippi. And these abandoned orphan wells are emitting methane into the atmosphere and also potentially leaking methane and other gases into groundwater, causing groundwater contamination. This is a very serious environmental problem, which has been very difficult to solve. And there's even been federal monies that have been granted to the state of Mississippi, $25 million as an initial grant, and subsequent monies up to about roughly about $31 million available to the state. But what we want to do is help the state of Mississippi to be able to solve this environmental problem through a very unique solution. And that very unique solution is Bitcoin mining. Unlike any other business in the world, Bitcoin mining is very location agnostic, which means that it can basically go anywhere, be anywhere, set up shop anywhere. So what you can do is you can go and set one of these shops up next to one of these mining facilities, next to an abandoned oil and gas well that is emitting methane. And just for your clarity, methane as a greenhouse gas is 84 times worse than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And it is 27 times worse over a 100-year period for warming. So anytime you can mitigate methane, you're helping the state to have a very significant and positive impact on its emissions profile. So what you do is you set up on these orphaned oil wells with Bitcoin mining operations. You capture the methane and you run it through a generator or a turbine to convert it into electricity. And then you take that electricity and you use that to mine Bitcoin. So that's the basic general gist of the policy. We think it's a win for the environment, it's a win for taxpayers, and it's a win for the economy.
On these abandoned oil wells, so there's no production, there's no net or monetary economic activity going on currently. Is that correct?
These abandoned oil and gas wells are left over maybe because of a boom and bust cycle in the oil and gas space, oil and gas industry, which, as you know, happens roughly every 5-10 years. There's some sort of a boom and bust cycle in the price of oil and gas. And what happens is that these abandoned wells, which were not properly mitigated or plugged, were put into the custody of the state. So the state of Mississippi has these abandoned oil wells in their custody, and they need to figure out how to solve, the state needs to try to figure out how to solve this problem. So what we want to do is create a way for you to solve the problem that saves taxpayer money and also generates revenue back to the state. And in the instance of the federal grant money, the more money you spend, the more jobs that you create through the plugging of these wells and through the mitigation of these wells, you get more federal money from the feds. So that's just kind of this positive feedback loop of driving revenue to the state. But currently, as it stands, there's no business or no way to go after and capture this methane because oftentimes it's remote. It's too far from a pipeline. It's too far from the grid to electrify. So Bitcoin mining, as I mentioned, can go anywhere, can be anywhere, and solve this problem.
What are there states that this is currently being, you're currently doing this?
There are 2 other states that we are working with very closely in the drafting process. That is Oklahoma and also in Texas.
All right. And you said these are state of Mississippi owned wells, or what about privately owned wells?
So in this specific policy, it's more so focused on the wells that are in the custody of the state of Mississippi.
Okay. So are there states that are actively doing this right now? Has this been passed anywhere that they've taken advantage of these methane producing wells that you're able to do this?
So there's a whole entire business model around taking methane from various sources, including flared gas. I mean, the state of Texas, Oklahoma, several other states have very big business models built around taking flared gas and converting that into electricity for the purpose of mining Bitcoin. So there are sophisticated operators in the space already doing this. And all we're asking now is for the state of Mississippi to open up these abandoned wells, which, you know, the state of Mississippi and Texas and Oklahoma and about 2 other dozen states have a significant portion of abandoned wells. So we're just asking these states, hey, there's already people doing this. You have a problem that needs to be solved. Let's let these guys come in and solve it.
What size, what type of electricity can be produced from these wells? A single well, how much power are you talking about?
It definitely ranges greatly. Some wells are producing a lot of methane. Some aren't producing any methane at all. What'll most likely happen is you'll see the Bitcoin miners come in and they'll be able to come in and take a look at large batches of these wells and determine which ones are the most economical to produce on. But I would say roughly anywhere between half and a full megawatt is achievable depending on the production of the well.
Okay. All right. Senator Barnett, you have a question?
I do. I live in an area of the state that's, if we're not number 1, we're number 2 in oil and gas production. That's Jasper County. So my question, and I'm sure we may have some abandoned wells. So my question to you is, do you have an example of what a mined Bitcoin would look like?
Yeah, so it's very much just a data center business. So these are very modular data centers. So just like how you would see with Amazon or Google, but they can be made to be very large or they can be made to be very small. And that's the one unique difference between a large data center company like Amazon or Google is we don't need to have these massive facilities in order to go in and solve unique problems. So they could be, you know, they could be the size of this table right here. Like one can be very, very small.
I understand what but you said that this is for mining Bitcoin. So my question to you again is what does a piece of Bitcoin or a gallon of Bitcoin or a quarter of Bitcoin? I just want to know, you know, what are we, I just want to know what does it look like when it comes out the ground?
Yeah.
It's a great question, Senator.
I mean, I know it may be funny to some, but I'm just, you say you're mining something, but how can you mine something that's invisible?
You may want to go back and explain kind of the digital side of Bitcoin and what it is.
I'll do my best. As you all know, we all talk a lot about Bitcoin and it's in the news pretty much every day. And it is very much like the internet can be difficult to explain and articulate in very few words, but I will absolutely do my best for you, Senator. So Bitcoin is a digital currency. And it is also a payment network. And for the first time in human history, that has been accomplished. Never before have we joined both. So in the past, you have dollars, you have euros, you have yen, and you have Visa, and you have PayPal, and you have MasterCard. Well, Bitcoin has brought both of those together into one, and that's what you know as Bitcoin. So sometimes when you hear someone say Bitcoin, they might be talking about the network, they might be talking about the asset. So the asset, as you know, has a dollar value that goes up and down on a regular basis. And that's the one component that I think you probably hear about the most in the news. Mostly what I do is I talk about the network side of things, the infrastructure that goes into maintaining Bitcoin. Very much like you need data centers for the internet, you need data centers for Bitcoin. So these data centers are looking for new places to go and to set up shop. And what they do is all they do is they take energy and they convert it to Bitcoin. That's the simple explanation on what they're trying to accomplish. But ultimately what they're doing is they're trying to solve a really difficult math problem. So the math problem is so difficult, in fact, that it's better to just guess it as quickly as you possibly can. So these machines, they will just guess and guess and guess and guess as quickly as they can until they find the right answer. And if they find that answer, they are granted this digital currency, and it is given to them once they complete the transaction. Now, we can get into like what Bitcoin is and what it isn't, but in the simplest of terms, it is just digital money that you can have in a digital wallet, and you remove any sort of physical manifestation of that. Very much like how we stopped having photos be physical, we made them digital. We're going to stop having money be physical and have it be completely digital.
Senator Barnett, do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, my follow-up question is, I've heard that explanation before. I understand now all of that, but my question is, if you're mining something, then there should be something that you can use to back up this digital currency with. So what are you actually going to be taking that's going to have a backing? I know the dollar is backed by gold. So what are we actually going to be mining that's going to guarantee this Bitcoin, or that we can use to back up this Bitcoin that we're talking about, what we're going to be using these old wells to mine this from?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Senator. Since 1971, the dollar has not been backed by anything. So the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, which has held up for some time now. Bitcoin as an asset is backed up by some of the same exact properties that gold is backed up by. It's backed up by physics. So some of the things that make money good money are things like transportability, portability, divisibility, durability, and Bitcoin has all of those components, and even better in some cases than gold. And one of the ones that is really important is scarcity. So when money is scarce, it holds its value better. That's, you know, where you get into these conversations around sound money. And gold has been the best money that we've had through human history, but unfortunately, central banks have co-opted gold and made it difficult to use as money. And also because it's, you know, it's heavy, right? And it's hard to break up into small pieces and to use for commerce. And so that's where we move towards the dollar. We move towards paper money, and now we have, you know, digital dollars as well. But Bitcoin is scarce in the fact that there only can ever be 21 million. That's it. No more ever again. Once we get to all 21 million, we'll be completely finished. And that scarcity is what allows you and others in your jurisdiction to be able to buy it and know that the government can't debase it very much like gold, but it also has the positive properties of being divisible and also transportable like digital dollars.
I have one more question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Being a former mayor and now legislature in one of the most oil and gas producing towns in Mississippi, we relied heavily on the taxes that was generated from the oil and gas that was produced in my town and in my county. So my question to you is that, or this body is that, if you are going in to rework some of these abandoned wells where you said there's a tremendous amount of methane gas and all that. So the revenue that's generated, are we going to be able to treat it just like we did the oil and gas severance money that came to the state? And then a portion of that goes back to the communities where this is being mined in? Because if we're going to be mining, if we're going to be reworking these wells, then I think that if there's going to be some monies that's generated from it, then it should be treated just like the previous oil and gas that's being produced in these communities now. So are we looking at a return to the state and a return to the communities as a result of what's being mined?
I mean, absolutely. That's as far as what gets returned to the state. That's completely up to, the state of Mississippi and the senators in this room and how this policy gets pushed forward. But the way it's crafted now, there will be revenue generated from this process. And also there will be money saved because the state is supposed to be plugging these wells, which costs roughly $50,000 to $100,000 per well to be able to plug and remediate. So they were saving the taxpayer money by solving the problem without needing any sort of taxpayer money being spent on the plugging process, and then also driving revenue to state coffers. But in all of this, we'll be creating jobs in most likely very rural parts of the country, of the state as well. So for us, it's a win for everyone involved. And I think that at the end of the day, you're going to be having more money in the state of Mississippi, more jobs, more economic value. I hope that answers your question.
No, it doesn't. My question again is that for every barrel of oil that's produced, a percentage of that money goes to the state. The state then returns a percentage of that back to those counties where this oil or gas is produced. So my question is, if we are producing this digital currency and we're using old abandoned oil wells to produce it, are we going to be able to see a return back to the community from where it was produced, because the state will collect taxes on it, and then a portion of that tax will be sent back to the counties where it's produced? I mean, to me, if what you're talking about is no different than oil and gas production, if we're using oil and gas wells to produce this. So I think that if we're going to do this, then it should be treated just like a traditional oil and gas well, or there should be some type of revenue return back to the county or the municipality where it's being produced.
I think you're also going to have, the investment in the facility and everything that goes on the property will come back. Ad valorem taxes will probably be adjusted on the property. So you'll have an ad valorem tax increase. You'll also have jobs created. And how we treat the methane, I'm not sure. I mean, we'll have to talk to the oil and gas board and some other folks and see how that's set up. But I mean, that's why we're having a hearing, is to talk about all this. So, Senator Jordan, do you have a question?
So methane is a greenhouse gas, and it has a warming impact on the planet, but it's much worse than CO2. CO2, as you all know, is something that governments across the United States and across the world are looking to tackle. But methane has become something of a very large concern, as we've noticed that it's having a significant impact on warming. So methane is 84 times worse than CO2 for warming. And so oftentimes what you'll do is, when you're trying to figure out, how much of a positive impact in emissions you're having, you calculate that in CO2. So when you take methane, one MCF of methane, you multiply that essentially times 84 when you're converting it back to CO2.
All right, Senator Blackman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You say that you are going to be looking at those wells that are owned by the state of Mississippi, correct?
That's correct.
And do you know how many wells there are?
It's very hard to document orphan and abandoned wells, but we estimate that there's anywhere from hundreds to thousands in the state.
And are you going to be purchasing these from the state?
So there will be a bidding process for the miners to come in and try to take those wells from the state to be able to drive revenue back to the state, yes.
And in the beginning, you mentioned something about federal. Can you explain that?
The Biden administration has given $25 million to 26 different states in the US to solve this environmental problem, with additional grant money that could be made available if the states show that they're using that money in a way to produce positive results. And those results can mean, spending money on the problem. It can mean reducing emissions, and it can also mean creating jobs in economically depressed zones.
So the state of Mississippi could access some of this $25 million if we were to allow you to mitigate.
So the $25 million was an upfront grant that has already been given to the state of Mississippi. And there is additional grant money up to $31 million when combined with the $25 million, that if this money is spent on trying to solve the problem, the 25 million, the initial grant, then you can unlock further funding from the federal government.
Okay, and are you trying to access that 25 million?
We are not trying to access the 25 million. We want this, you already have the 25 million in the state of Mississippi.
I know. But you say we've been granted it and we have to do something with it, with a plan. And so you don't have anything.
I think the money was used to plug these wells. They weren't plugged properly. So the 25 million is for the state to go and plug the wells. Is that my understanding?
Yes, Senator.
Okay, that's what it is.
Okay. And do you know how much money would be generated from a well utilizing models that you mentioned, Texas and Oklahoma?
So depending on the price of Bitcoin and also the rate negotiated for the well, it would be highly dependent on both of those scenarios. But typically for if a Bitcoin miner, for instance, is trying to mine Bitcoin, they're usually looking at trying to mine it for anywhere between below $10,000 per coin. And the price today is roughly about $20,000 today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Wiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of go back to the beginning, that way I can come back to my question. Basically, what you want to do, you're going to go into the depleted wells that are not being used, and you're going to build the mining facility or the farms, what I've heard them called in the past, and you're going to take the methane gas to power that process, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, so when you build the farm, you're putting a building with computers inside that are actually doing the mining, correct?
That's correct.
When you're in the process of the mining and you've stated that the 21 million is the cap of the Bitcoin, how many Bitcoin are there currently?
There are just over 19 million Bitcoin currently in circulation.
Okay, so if we're currently over 19 million and we're capped at 21 million, roughly 2 million left to go, how long are we saying that it would take to mine these remaining 2 million?
It's a great question, Senator. There are metrics in place to help ensure that Bitcoin doesn't get mined too rapidly as further along in its adoption process. That is called the halvening, and it prevents miners from coming in and mining all the Bitcoin up before the pre-programmed final date, which is in 2140. So the last Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140.
Okay, so if we have metrics in place that are keeping us from reaching this point too rapidly, does that mean that the more miners come into production, the slower the rate for each miner?
That's correct. That's roughly a good way to explain it. Yes.
So if we have a metric in place that's going to reduce the ability for them to meet a certain goal, how do we know that this is a productive venture for the miner or for the state?
Methane that is produced out of the ground as a fuel source that comes from oil and abandoned oil and gas wells is arguably one of the cheapest forms of any energy that anybody can access. And the localized cost of energy would roughly be around 1 to 2 cents per kilowatt. And so most miners that are large miners that are on grid, which is where the majority of Bitcoin mining takes place, is through traditional power generation sources. The cheapest that they're getting is about 3 to 4 cents. So there's a term in the space, in many spaces, called the last man standing. So anybody that's using methane, whether it be from landfills or orphan and abandoned wells as well, will have the cheapest form of energy, and thus will be one of the most sustainable business models in the space.
I understand that, but there are going to be other associated costs with running the farm or the mine. Other than the power, you've got the equipment that goes into it, the buildings. So that's kind of where I'm wondering on this, if we've got metrics that are going to cap the productivity, especially as more miners come online. One other question, and I understand 2140 is a long time away from now, but I think that we as a body, we have to always look into the future. What happens to these once that completion date has arrived? Because once you hit the completion date and you're at the 21 million, you're not going to need the mines anymore, correct?
That's correct. There won't be any new Bitcoin created. However, going back to my comments earlier where I talked about Bitcoin as an asset and as a payment network, well, there are fees to being able to transact on Bitcoin, the network. So those fees also get given to the Bitcoin miners.
Okay, so the Bitcoin miners are going to be receiving fees from that point forward, but what happens to the site where the Bitcoin was mined to begin with, these wells that you're going to be using? What happens to them then? Do they return to the state, or what happens to them?
The current framework for the policy would be that the Bitcoin miner, if they're no longer operating on the well, would be mandated to plug that well. So it would be sealed and would no longer emitting methane, which is a big positive for the environment.
So whoever is operating it, not the state, would be required to plug the well.
That's correct.
And I understand that these miners are going to be paying dividends to the state as this goes along, correct?
Yes,
And that would be paid in the form of Bitcoin.
that's correct, Senator.
How does the state have an assurance that the Bitcoin is worth something and not worth nothing?
So if the state does not want to hold the Bitcoin, you can instantly convert that to dollars seamlessly through multiple different avenues that are available today to the state.
What happens if the Bitcoin is not worth $1?
Excuse me?
What happens if the Bitcoin is not worth $1?
It's not worth $1?
What if it's not? I mean, we've talked about there's nothing to back it. I'm speaking from a what if perspective on this because, more of a question because I don't know.
I think at the end of the day that these sites that are cleaning up methane, if there's nobody doing it in the first place, and yet miners are willing to come in and try to solve this problem, let's say 10 years from now that Bitcoin is worth nothing. Well, in that 10 years, you had a very big positive impact on these sites and cleaning up the environment. So I think it's important to be taking into consideration, what would happen if Bitcoin were to go to zero? But if Bitcoin goes to zero, then still the state during the time that Bitcoin had value was able to clean up abandoned oil and gas wells, return value to the state of Mississippi. But that's a great question. I don't think anybody really truly knows, what would happen if Bitcoin went to zero, except for in the case of those abandoned oil and gas wells. We know we've had a positive impact in the time that Bitcoin did have value.
All right.
I have another question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, and Senator Blackman asked the question, and I didn't hear an answer from her question. Senator Whaley asked a question, and it still didn't get answered. So my question is, if you're going in and you're going to buy these wells to mine this Bitcoin, or this air currency that I call it, how are you going to pay the state initially for these wells? Are you going to use Bitcoin, or we're going to use what we're used to now, and that's green dollars? Are we going to use gold or diamonds or something? Because I don't think that we need to put the state to a point to where we got to take a payment on something that we don't have anything to back it for. We don't know if it's going to be good tomorrow for the taxpayers of the state of Mississippi. So you're going to buy this with the current currency that we use to mine your big currency?
I believe that the state of Mississippi would require that Bitcoin miners pay in dollars.
Okay. And again, I know this is going to sound funny to a lot of you all, but you keep talking about the mining of the Bitcoin, and when it gets to a certain amount, then it stops. You talk about it in a way to where we can actually see it, or we can hold it. But you haven't been able to tell me yet how or why now that this is an important thing with the methane gas, because if methane gas was such an important product, then I'm sure that with the number of oil and gas companies out there, they would have found some type of way to reuse this in some of their process. And I just don't understand how using this to mine virtual coin is going to pay dividends for the state of Mississippi.
Yeah, so, the Bitcoin itself, going to your question around, whether or not you can hold it or not, I think that many things over the past several decades have been completely digitized, and that's simply what is happening with money. And there are positive implications of removing the physical nature of money and making it completely digital. one of the positive impacts of entirely digitizing money is the ability to send it via cross-border payments rapidly and with short settlement times. And so you'll see that as time goes on, we've already seen this in various countries, that cross-border payments have been made easier and cheaper because of Bitcoin. There are individuals in El Salvador and Africa using Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining as a means of transaction. And it's saving them having to walk to the money transmitter sites to be able to send and receive money. And it's also allowing them to save, is because Bitcoin mining as a medium of exchange for cross-border payments is a fraction of the cost for those in those countries. So when someone from the United States is sending money to their loved one in El Salvador, they are doing it in a way where they are saving money, so they're able to receive more money to the individual in El Salvador, and also making it safer, because traveling to and from money transmitter sites in the country of El Salvador can be very dangerous. So not only are you making it, like I said, safer, but cheaper for those individuals. I would love to also, by the way, if you're interested in at any point diving very deep into the technical components of Bitcoin mining, and that offer goes and is extended to any individual here. But this process is very much complex, and one of the ways that I like to compare it to is the internet, right? It's like we all know the benefits of the internet. We know we can transmit this live over to those of the folks that are watching it on YouTube. We can order Amazon, we can order Uber on our phones. We all understand the benefits of that technology, but I mean, I find it very hard to believe, and I know for myself personally, I very rarely find someone who can explain to me exactly how the internet works. And that's why we as an organization at Satoshi Action Fund focus on the benefits of the technology and focus on how we can make not only Mississippi, but various other states be able to solve unique environmental problems and economic problems in their states.
Thank you. Senator McMahon's got a question.
My question will be brief. Looking on lines 27 and 28, it talks about these orphan wells on public and private lands. Where does a landowner, how would a landowner seek relief if they're contesting the orphan well? In other words, a lot of these wells, you got to cross private property to get to it, and the landowner might say he owns the well. Does this legislation, does this board that you're creating, are they going to have authority on that, or can they still seek relief in the courts?
I would probably leave that question for my policy director, Eric Peterson. He can answer, and there may be a couple questions that would be better for him to cover if he gets a moment to come up and speak.
He will. Well, he's going to come up next.
Okay, and the other question is, what assurances do we have that, the Bitcoin operator is not going to leave us with orphan wells? Because it was never intended for there ever to be, every single well is supposed to have an owner. So what's going to be that guarantee?
This is a great area for Eric, if you would like him to come up and answer some of these great questions.
I may have one more question for you after this, but
okay,
Eric,
we'll switch back and forth.
yeah, Eric, you want to come up and answer his questions real quick?
Thank you, Senator. My name is Eric Peterson. I'm the policy director of Satoshi Action Fund. To your first question, the state would have to document first that this was indeed an orphan and abandoned oil well, and they would just go through the oil and gas board like they would from any other process. To your question about to make sure that the well was not again abandoned, leaving it in the care of the state, there's a bonding process. The Bitcoin miner would have to prove to the oil and gas board who would run this program that both that they are a bona fide Bitcoin miner with experience mining in this sphere, and also place the appropriate bond. So even if, as Senator said, Bitcoin went to zero and the Bitcoin mining industry stopped, they would still have to put up sufficient capital to make sure that that well is closed after that period of time.
I'm glad you guys already thought that through. Thank you, Counselor.
Senator Parker.
And this could be for either. I mean, what I'm trying to get to here, because sometimes I can feel kind of in the committee questions, and I'm trying to understand, okay, where the questions come from. You have a very complex business model. And from a background standpoint, in this committee, we have a lot of different backgrounds here. I don't know of anybody in this committee who has the background, but I'm an eye doctor, and I can throw terms at you like a regmatogenous retinal detachment and other things like that and speak for a long time.
and we never would get anything out of that. So I want to try to just kind of take this down to a little different level. I think some of the misunderstanding of this is the fact that we're talking about the collection of methane as a kind of a financial model to kind of help move you forward. And then we're also talking about Bitcoin mining, which is not the same thing. You know, so you have the collection of the methane, then you have Bitcoin mining, which to my understanding has more to do with the computer algorithms, kind of moving towards that solution, which is done with, I guess, the proceeds that you would then be getting from what you're doing in the methane collection. Am I thinking about this correctly?
Sure. Let me go and just sort of explain it step by step. Bitcoin mining is very simply the process of running specialized computers, and this requires generally a large amount of energy. So the Bitcoin mining industry is always looking for a unique energy assets. In this case,
it's the methane.
And so in this case, it's stranded methane.
So our decision that we're working on here today is, do we as a state think that the investment in this, you know, to the return for the Bitcoin, and I know, again, I'm not an expert on Bitcoin, but I've done a little research into it. I mean, it's very complex, and to your point of, you know, taking another 100 years to, you know, collect the remaining 2 million. I don't know that maybe anybody in this room really wants to hear that explanation, you know, especially, you know, just the little research I go into it to refresh my memory, you know, it's pretty complicated, you know, but you essentially, I think in this committee and in this room as a whole, your goal is to convince us that this investment opportunity, basically by the state, would pay us dividends in the future, you know, based on our, you know, how we feel about the Bitcoin method.
Yeah, I often say this policy doesn't require this committee to believe in the future of Bitcoin at all. All it requires is that you believe that folks can, you know, do what they say, which is capture that methane and run a computer program, and that they will pay dividends in the state. And as I said, they will have placed a bond to cap the oil and gas well, which again runs anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. So in our mind, you have somebody who is willing to take an asset that is not currently being used by anybody because it cannot reach a pipeline. It can't be gone into somebody's home and used on a burner. But there is a business will do this and return money to the state and fix an environmental problem that the state has had money allocated for the federal government to address.
Okay, thank you.
I guess, you know, the way I look at it is these local communities on these abandoned wells are getting 100% of zero. There's no production going on. There's absolutely no economic activity related to these orphan wells. It's not going to cost the state a penny, is my understanding. You bid it out to these companies and they take the action and then they make the investment in capturing the methane, converting it to electricity and using that to supply the power for the data center to do all the mining. It's, you know, the way I look at it is you're getting 100% of nothing right now. Or you're getting all of it and it's not producing anything. This is an option or an opportunity to create some economic activity in areas where there is methane available. If the well has enough of it, it's producing and it can sustain the electrical needs of a data center, which is essentially what it is. It's a mini data center. Depending on the amount of methane, they can size it appropriately, and it will produce revenue for that local community or county. So it'll create some jobs, it'll create some economic activity where there's zero right now. So that's, I guess that's the impetus behind why we want to look at this bill. Obviously, we've got a lot of questions and want to get with the Oil and Gas Board to see how, what their thoughts are and any pitfalls we may have out there. But Eric, if you would kind of move over into the digital currency bill and kind of give us the rundown on that, which goes back to Bitcoin and kind of give us your side of that policy, please.
Sure. SB 2603, the Digital Mining Protection Act, has 3 separate sections in it. The first is that a protection for folks who are in the Bitcoin mining space. They have in other states run into some issues in terms of folks upset about their business for one reason or another. So we have put in language that would guarantee a Bitcoin miner can operate in a locality as long as they are zoned for industrial use, just like any other sort of business that might produce noise, use electricity. We obviously don't want that in our rural or our residential and commercial zones, but we feel that there'll be more investment in the state of Mississippi if folks in the Bitcoin mining space know that as long as they're zoned properly, they can operate in the state of Mississippi. The second section is a creation of a Bitcoin mining council to be appointed by various folks throughout the state. They'll look at a variety of issues, including how Bitcoin mining can aid in the build out of renewable energy, address the orphaned oil well issue that we have been discussing, work on balancing the grid. As you know, we all felt a few weeks ago, it got very cold in the state of Mississippi, and there was a lot of strain on the power grid, and we feel that Bitcoin mining can help in that regard to balance the grids during times of intense need. And finally, at the end, there's a definition of virtual currency. In our mind, this is just simple cleanup language. Most of the states in the United States have adopted some definition of virtual currency. You know, if you're going to run a Bitcoin mining business and create something and sell it for dollars or use it for payments in the state of Mississippi, and we absolutely hope that they do. We just feel that, you know, there needs to be a law explaining what it is and how it should be treated.
What states are using digital currency right now as a form of payment?
Colorado is using Bitcoin as a form of tax payment. The city of New York has used it as payments previously. Some of their employees have been paid. The state of Ohio did so for a short period of time before the treasurer. There's also a committee in the state of Louisiana looking forward to taking some cryptocurrencies as payment for taxes and other fees.
Explain how that would happen if I got an income tax bill, or if I had a ad valorem tax bill. Could you make your payment through Bitcoin? Does that, any transaction fees, how does that happen in a state that does it?
Yeah, let me point out that this is not in this piece of legislation that we were discussing. That said, there's a variety of ways that you could do it. The state treasurer could simply have a digital wallet which accepted tax payments from folks in Bitcoin. Not only would that be transparent because it would be on the blockchain, right? You could prove, I could prove to the state, or any of us could look up and see that tax payment in the form of Bitcoin and know exactly when that happened and in what amount. But those fees would in fact be paid for by the person sending the Bitcoin. There are also a variety of services that exist today where if somebody wanted to pay in Bitcoin and the state wanted to collect dollars, that could be done seamlessly, again, without or very minimal cost to the state.
So they could allow somebody to pay in Bitcoin, but it could be transferred into dollars into the state treasury.
Yeah, that's.
And they would get the 100% the net.
That's exactly correct, Senator.
Okay. All right. From a safety perspective of digital currency, what are the big pitfalls, or what are some of the things that I mean, obviously we hear about what happened in the news. I know that's kind of a different animal altogether. It's more of an exchange, but what as far as digital currency that an individual may own or use, what are the safety pros or cons of it that you see?
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of pros and cons to any sort of currency and how you hold it. Obviously, the FTX scandal that so many of us have seen in the news is really a failure of a centralized exchange, in the same way that folks traded or trusted Sam Bankman-Fried, they trusted Bernie Madoff, or some other folks who have run investment schemes. And at the end of the day, this is no different. When we're talking about virtual currency, there's a variety of ways to hold it safely, included holding it on your cell phone. That is how I hold it. There's a variety of hardware devices where you could hold virtual currency. And there's a variety of businesses across the country that allow it to hold virtual currency in a very safe way that is sort of immune from the fraud that we saw in the FTX case.
So people can hack in your bank account and pull money out. People can access your credit cards to charge on. Is it possible to hack into your wallet and spend money, or how does that?
Again, this is outside the scope of the bill. It is possible to do that. There are a variety of steps that an individual could take. I would say, recently my phone was stolen and it had all my cryptocurrency on it, and I was able to recover all of it without any of it being stolen. I've had my wallet stolen before, and let me tell you, I did not get that cash back. So there's a variety of pros and cons on exactly how this works. But in general, you know, the state could hold this in a very safe manner, and there's a variety of ways that people could do to protect themselves from bad actors in the space.
And you can convert digital currency pretty much immediately upon a transaction. If somebody paid, if they don't want to, obviously the value of Bitcoin fluctuates over, you know, all day long. It's going up and down. When somebody pays you, you can convert it instantaneously to receive the actual dollar amount that's owed. So somebody, you know, owes a $5,000 tax bill and they make $5,000 payment in Bitcoin. It may cost them $5,005 or $5,020 or $5,100. I don't know what the number would be, but the Treasury could do a simultaneous swap to dollars where the state gets the $5,000.
That is exactly correct. There are, again, there are a variety of companies that would act in that manner to make sure that the state was made whole, didn't pay any fees, and received the full amount of their tax bills in US dollars.
Okay. Well, to Senator Barnett's point, you know, I never thought I'd see the day that people would be, you know, renting their house out on the internet to strangers, or getting in somebody's car and driving them around. And so, but, you know, never say never, but it's seemingly more and more likely that digital currency is an option. I definitely wouldn't want to make it a standard. I think we need options, but I think it's becoming more and more prevalent in day-to-day transactions. And from my understanding, it clears quickly. It's, you know, very transparent. There's a record of it. So it seems like it may be a plausible avenue for us to go down eventually. I wanted to have this hearing to let us ask questions. I think Senator Johnson, you have any questions? Oh, Senator Carter had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You made a statement earlier about how crypto mining, these mines consume crazy amounts of electricity. She said in the event of energy shortage that those mines could possibly help out the grid. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because of the energy usage of Bitcoin mining and the fact that it is time agnostic to when it wants to mine Bitcoin, it wants to mine Bitcoin at 3 in the morning in the same way it wants to at 3 in the afternoon. Obviously, our demand for power does not go in that same cycle, right? As people go to sleep and stop using the computers or phones and televisions, the demand for power drops. So Bitcoin is very helpful in keeping a stable load for generation. Also, like you said, it has the ability to turn off almost instantaneously. So when the winter storm came down, all of the Bitcoin miners in the Midwest, all the way down south, essentially shut off. So the power that they were consuming, that was being generated for them, and it increased the number of build out and the number of energy, or the amount of energy being generated, was returned to people's homes. It's estimated that Bitcoin miners shut down in Texas enough to return power to heat 1.5 million homes or power 300 hospitals. And that is energy generation that might not have occurred outside of Bitcoin mining.
So basically what you said was that the Bitcoin mine shut down, which opened the grid up for residential and the various producers, consumers of energy in Texas. But what I didn't hear is, well, I thought you said earlier that y'all have the capability of adding power to the grid. But what I heard in the response was basically you were giving the grid back its power by shutting down your servers.
Yeah, so there's two ways in which it can help the power grid. One is by encouraging the build out of new energy sources, including renewable, nuclear, traditional power generation, because Bitcoin mining is always a first customer. So, you know, if you generate power in a new area, you need somebody to sell power to, and it's always happy to purchase that power at a reasonable rate. And then, yes, again, they're not generating new power to return to the grid. But, you know, they, unlike a lot of other things, as Dennis said, Amazon data centers, Google, if you put one of those centers in there, they lack the ability to shut down because it causes a network-wide outage that a lot of folks rely on. Bitcoin does not work that way. They can shut down, you know, 50% of the network in an instant, and Bitcoin transactions continue along.
In the event we were to allow y'all to use these orphan wells, to use the methane gas to power these methane generators, would there be ability, if there were an energy shortage in the state of Mississippi, to shut down the mining and plug the methane generator power into the grid?
Yeah, that would take a variety of investment to plug into the grid. That is theoretically something you could do. My guess is if it was economically prudent to do so, that the wells wouldn't have been abandoned and off grid in the first place. The real benefit to the orphan well program is many of these wells are again leaking methane currently, and there's no economical case for either, you know, building a pipeline out there or generating electricity on site and selling it to the grid. Instead, Bitcoin mining is another use for that energy that would otherwise be wasted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blackman, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at the bill, and it provides in section 2(3). No, 2, I'm sorry, about allowing for node to run a node or a series of nodes for the purpose of home digital asset mining at a private residence. What would this entail?
Yeah, a node is just a very small computer that keeps a record of the entire blockchain of Bitcoin transactions. They use very little power, create very little noise, though they have, you know, been subjects of some controversy as folks think there's something different. So it's just that people could run these very small computers in their home.
Okay, but then it says in 3 that the digital asset mining business in an area zoned for industrial use.
Yes. So a node is a very small computer that uses very little energy, creates very little sound. A digital asset mining business, we define in this legislation as over 1 megawatt. That would require a large amount of space and a large amount of computers. And, you know, would either, if it's cooled via fans, would create some noise, or if it's cooled via liquid, would not create noise. But you would never be able to run a digital asset mining business in a residential area. You couldn't draw the power or have the space.
Okay, in this additional 3, there's an error here. On line 53, you have 2 3s. It says that no political subdivision shall place any specific additional limit on sound decibels generated by home digital asset mining beyond the current limits set forth for other forms of sound pollution. What if this is a new process? Cities and counties would not necessarily have already created any zoning related to this. So why are we going to restrict them before this new process has even come on board?
Sure, that's a great question, Senator. Let me take a step back and talk to you about the purpose of the first part of this bill. One of the reasons America is now a leader in Bitcoin mining, creating billions of dollars in wealth and thousands of jobs across the country, is because China banned Bitcoin mining for a variety of purposes, mostly because they're going to introduce their own virtual currency and did not want to compete with Bitcoin. As it's moved, there's been a lot of misconceptions about digital asset mining in a variety of ways, both at industrial use and home use. And the purpose of this bill is to make clear where it is permitted and under what circumstance it's permitted. So many folks will say, oh my gosh, I hear Bitcoin mining is so loud. We need to put in a new ordinance about that. And from our perspective, you know, we think that home Bitcoin mining, which again, it would be done at a very, very small scale, just shouldn't be treated any different than if I were to, say, be playing video games, put on my music, watching a movie, anything of that nature.
But I'm talking about even if it's in an area zoned for industrial.
If it is, so,
If the decibels are so loud and a city or county presently
so.
has no zone.
Sure. So if you look at 3 on line 54, it says specific additional limit on sound decibels generated by home digital asset mining. So that excludes the digital asset mining over 1 megawatt, which we define as a digital asset mining business.
And on lines 57 to 59, it says that we can't, a political subdivision can't impose any requirement for digital asset mining business, which is not also a requirement for data centers in its jurisdiction. If the political subdivision presently has no data center, and they haven't envisioned creating any zoning for a data center until one comes into their area, then this would prevent that political subdivision from imposing on the digital asset mining business something that they could do for the data center.
So the way we understand this, Senator, is that we view Bitcoin mining the same as any data center from Google, Netflix, Amazon. And we just want to make sure that they're treated fairly by the same municipality. For example, in Missoula, Montana, they have placed a requirement on Bitcoin miners that they have to be 100% renewable energy, but for their Google data center, they have no such requirement. So that is why this is drafted this way. They both use large amounts of energy. They both use computers. They're both, have the same sort of ups and downs. And we just want to make sure that they're being treated equally by the state or by the locality.
Okay, and on line 66 to 68, the Public Service Commission is going to be the entity that oversees, and we are restricting them that they shall not establish a discriminatory rate schedule for digital asset mining businesses. Have you seen that occur?
We have. We've seen it occur far too often, unfortunately, where again, folks in the digital asset mining business have the same sort of requirements as data centers or other industrial uses of electricity. And public service commissions have tried to charge them higher rates because they don't view these as legitimate businesses, or they have tried to not pay them for having them shut down to return power to the grid, which by other regulations, they're required by law to do. If you look at our definition of discriminatory rate on line 42, we just define discriminatory rate needs an electricity rate substantially different from other industrial uses of electricity in similar geographic areas. Again, our goal, Senator, is to just make sure that digital asset mining businesses are treated the same as other similar businesses in similar geographic areas. We're not looking for special exemptions or carve outs, just simply that folks be able to start up their businesses, make millions of dollars of investment in Mississippi, create those jobs, and know they are not going to be discriminated against by local governments. Again, this is not something that has happened so far in the state of Mississippi, but it's certainly something that Bitcoin miners are on the lookout for, and we believe they'll make even greater investments in the state of Mississippi with these very simple protections.
Will the Public Service Commission govern the node or series of nodes that's in the home digital?
They won't have to. They don't draw enough energy usage that they might show up an extra $5 or $10 a month on a bill, but there would not be drawing any more than, attaching another gaming computer in a house or anything of the sort.
And line 69 to 72, where you say that it's not going to be a money transmitter.
Yes. There was, a few years ago, there was a change to federal law in the way that they defined the term was broker, which required them to give money to the, or give data to the federal government about their customers. Digital asset miners don't have any of that data. They don't know when they're sending transactions, which is what they're doing on the Bitcoin network. They don't have any data on who those people are. That's not what they're in the business of doing. And so we're just making it clear in Mississippi law for a digital asset miner that they are not actually in the business of sending money in the same way that somebody is writing a check or a bank. It's a very, again, this is much more of a data center business. It would be like requiring Google to hand over or AT&T to hand over data about who is going on their Chase checking account.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Those are good questions.
Senator Barnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question is, Senator Blackman asked a question a while back in regards to you all using the money from the federal government.
Yes.
And your answer to her was no. But in section 3, starting on lines 42 to 46, that's exactly where some of the money is coming from, unless I'm reading this wrong. My other question to you is also, it's not so much as the mining of air that I call it, but the safety of the people in the community. And again, I come from an area where I'm very familiar with the oil and gas industry, because everywhere I live, there's either an old oil well or an old gas well. And I think the reason they leave these abandoned is because they have got all the usefulness out of it that they can safely. And some of those gases are best left where they are because they understand how volatile it could be. Example of the one we're talking about, methane gas. It's odorless, colorless. If it gets the right amount of air, or if it's not mined right, then it has a great potential of being very, very explosive. And we're talking about mining something that the oil companies abandoned. They abandoned it not because it wasn't producing, but they abandoned it because they had gotten all that they could get out of it. And if this gas was another stream of revenue for them, I'm sure that they would have used it as well. So why are we going in and mining something that is very hazardous to a community?
Is that, you finished, Senator? So
yes, my two questions is, number one, and I'm asking this because I'm not seeing total transparency here. You explained to Senator Blackman that none of this money will be used from the federal government, but it states it in section 3. And then we're talking about, and you haven't talked about the dangers or anything of mining the methane gas. You're just talking about the possibility of this digital coin and maybe the possibility of using it for an electric, you know, possibility down the road. So I just have a lot of concern about this, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so let me apologize if there was a misstatement. The way the orphaned oil well bill is drafted is we do suggest using some of that money that is coming down from the federal government to start this program with the Oil and Gas Board. We still believe that is a win for taxpayers, because any money that would come from that federal money, we think would not only be paid back to the state, but again, the Bitcoin miner would take on the responsibility of plugging or remediating that well. Again, that can run anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000. So you can do the math on how many wells you might be able to plug at $25 million. To answer your question about safety, there are folks who are mining on methane gas today. They're doing it in Oklahoma, they're doing it in Texas, they're doing it in North Dakota, their oil companies are doing it. And one of the requirements in order to win the bid of a well, to take temporary possession of that well, to have access to that methane, is that they would have to submit paperwork to the Oil and Gas Board showing that they could do so safely and effectively. I believe that is the language that we use, and they have a history of doing this, as well as, again, placing a bond on their ability to mitigate and reclaim the well to environmental standards set by the state after that period of time. I hope that answers your question.
All right, Senator Sparks for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The mining of the Bitcoin, understand, is 21 million is your max supply, and we've mined about 19. Has this been going on since about 2009? Is that kind of when Bitcoin came online?
That's correct, Senator.
And it's way above my pay grade or understanding. But if you've mined 19 out of 21 in 14 years, what's going on in the next 118 years that we're only going to mine 2 million?
Sure. Every few years, the amount of Bitcoin that is put into circulation every 10 minutes is halved. So right now, the reward, I believe, is 6.25 in 2024. That will be halved, and then halved again, and your sort of exponential halving will drastically slow the amount of Bitcoin that is coming into the system. So much Bitcoin was put out at the beginning because they wanted to really speed up adoption, but that was the time where Bitcoin was trading at cents, and obviously now it is sitting somewhere around $20,000.
And as much as I don't understand blockchain technology, I get 21 and 19. And the issue then would be, it sounds like that the demand is going to increase, and because the supply is decreasing. Do you expect that to affect Bitcoin pricing?
Yeah, without making specific guesses on prices, there's a lot of people who've looked very foolish doing that over the years, and I will not add myself to be one of them. I think the most important chart when I think about Bitcoin is if you look at the number of wallets and the amount of Bitcoin adoption. And if you were to take that chart and overlay it with how many people are being connected to the World Wide Web in the 90s, they look very similar. And so this is our belief that this technology will be around to stay for a long period of time, and at minimum, a period of time to effectively mine Bitcoin off of these orphaned oil wells. And more importantly, and this is really why we've suggested this piece of legislation, to close them and to deal with an issue that Mississippi and other states around the country are facing. We feel that this is a unique technology. It is our duty as good stewards of our environment to use that technology to help take care of our planet.
And I appreciate that. My concern probably gets more back to the actual grid. If you have less released and it's halved, is the inverse true that you have to chase it twice as hard? In other words, do you need more capacity to be able to mine Bitcoin because it's halving every time there's a distribution?
Yeah, that gets into very specific sets of business that I'm not going to comment on exactly. What I would say, what it does do, and one of the reasons that this orphaned oil well or other sources of energy that are orphaned are so attractive to Bitcoin miners, and why Bitcoin miners is unique to tackle many of the challenges, is because the lower they can get the price of energy, the more computers they can set up, the more profitable they can be, as again, that difficulty curve increases. So they're always going to be looking for sources of energy that you and I will probably never use to charge our cell phones, to heat our homes, to anything like that. But because Bitcoin mining can be deployed almost anywhere on Earth, it creates a unique opportunity to access some of these energy sources.
Yeah, because my concern ultimately is the grid. We have federal intervention legislation that is dealing with the auto dealer market, which you need to charge your car to get back and forth. And we're seeing movement in that. We see Bitcoin. There's a tremendous amount of energy that's needed. You were asked by the chairman that you created, his question was, have you created? I believe, understood that. And you're like, well, no, actually, our demand pushes people to create more capacity because we're a buyer.
That's
all right, which means you're a drain on the grid, or you are a user of the grid. Now, if you don't have enough capacity, you talked about being shut down. Who shut you down? Because you even talked about some compensation for being shut down.
Yeah.
So assume you're in Mississippi and we have a freeze, or we have some issue, or there's hurricanes that have taken some things offline. We're more interested, obviously, in running electricity to homes, not so much for the Bitcoin. but tell me how you were taken off the grid or asked to shut down.
Yeah, it happens in a variety of states in a variety of different ways. But most of the time, Bitcoin miners will voluntarily shut down for a variety of reasons. One is that, after a hurricane, power prices are going to go up. And they are very uninterested at purchasing power at 20 cents a kilowatt hour to run their Bitcoin miner. That would be very unprofitable. And nobody's in the business of losing money, especially when it comes to energy that could much rather be used by their neighbors who are recovering from a hurricane. Again, Texas has had a few deep freezes now. They're one of the largest Bitcoin miners in the country. I believe Riot Blockchain uses something close to a gigawatt. And during the freeze, they shut down voluntarily. They view it as being a good neighbor, but also, running a good business model. There's just no incentive for them to run anytime during a natural disaster. But outside of that, there are a variety of mechanisms, both run by public service commissions, that I don't understand very well. Dennis can speak to that better. If you have some more questions, we can certainly talk afterwards. But to make sure that power is going where it's needed most. And then at times when power is at low demand, that Bitcoin can continue to purchase that energy, and again, kind of great grid balance.
Okay, and that's kind of the key issue is that you're talking about a regulated commodity, if you will, in this state that has a limited amount of production. And while taking over wells, they're not being utilized. I understand that whole concept. When you talk about being shut down and even compensation, because you couldn't mine, you couldn't chase the Bitcoin. We have to address that because we have a public service commissioner that is in charge of that regulation. And, I just want to make sure I understand that component of it as we move forward.
Yeah, one of the best parts about Bitcoin mining is because it can shut down so quickly compared to other industrial uses of electricity. For example, factories, right? It's really hard to shut down a car production plant that's going 24/7. You can't just really freeze anything in place, but shutting down a computer is really no different than turning off your laptop or your computer at home. It's slightly more complicated than that, but very little more complicated than that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dennis, for coming and presenting. No other questions from the committee. Motion to rise and report. All in favor, say aye. Opposed?